Investment is a job in itself. To figure out what to do with your money in order to beat inflation is something that, there are professionals out there on Wall Street that have PhDs in finance, that have enormous computers, and they have enormous staffs of PhDs and master's degrees and math nerds that are crunching numbers and figuring out how to allocate your portfolio so that you can beat inflation. And guess what? The majority of them don't beat inflation. The majority of them can't beat inflation, not as measured by CPI, which is completely fraudulent. But if you remember,
14%.
yeah, that 14%, or even, the 7%, like if you look at just the increase in the money supply, which I think is a much better metric. And this is what's reflected on the desirable goods. Like if you look at the price of real estate in Miami Beach, as Michael Saylor mentioned in your example, it goes up at around 6-7% per year on average over the last century. So that's, if you want to live in a nice area, that's what's happening to real estate. If you want to go to the good universities, that's what's going up. It's going up at a rate that's similar to the increase in the money supply. And you can beat CPI, but CPI is designed so you can beat it, but you can't really beat the appreciation in the things that you actually want to buy, in the price of good food, the price of good real estate. So, most investment professionals fail at doing that. So what hope does a doctor or an engineer or a scientist or an athlete have in doing those things?
So investment is hard and saving should be easy.
Exactly. Saving is essential for us as a civilization. And what fiat did is it took that away from us, and then it forced everybody to become an investor, or more accurately, a gambler, because you're not just because the money itself is broken, because the money itself is constantly changing in value. Investing is becoming more of a crapshoot. I mean, value investing is completely underperforming compared to market analysis. You listen to the Fed, and what matters to the price of individual companies is monetary policy much more than it is their own performance. So basically, you need to be a junkie watching the Fed and following all of the world's central banks, and you need to learn macroeconomics, and you need to learn what all the central banks are doing, and you need to understand how commodity markets work, and you need to understand how equity markets work, and bond markets, and real estate markets. You need to do all of those things just in order to be able to save and earn and keep the money that you've already earned.
Yeah.
That's the criminal thing about it. Like, I've already earned that money being a doctor, being a dentist, being an athlete, being an engineer. I built a house for somebody and I got that money. And all I want to do is just make sure that I can have it 10 years from now. The only way to do so is to become a crappy engineer, because you have to spend half your time not doing engineering and instead spend half of that time learning about Japanese central bank monetary policy and commodity markets, and what's going to happen to copper, and what's going to happen to oil, and what's happening in the wars, and what's happening with foreign policy, and Russia and the US, and all of those things. Under the gold standard, you didn't care about any of that stuff. Your gold coin worked regardless of all of those things. So what this means is the future. So first of all, we have all of the problems I mentioned, but also it means that the future becomes much more uncertain. So you're far less likely to provide for yourself 10 years from now, far less likely to find an easy way to give yourself value 10 years from now. And so you become more short-termist. And that is reflected economically in a lower savings rate, and we see savings rates decline. But it is also reflected in all manners of decision-making. And I think if you really want to see what it is, take a look at a society that goes through hyperinflation, and look at what happens there. How do people change under hyperinflation? And compare that to essentially what we see in the 20th century all over under not hyperinflation, but under low inflation. 10, 15% that you see across the board most of the time is just slow motion hyperinflation. So what happens in hyperinflation? Everybody gets their paychecks. They run straight to the supermarket. They spend all of their money. Nobody thinks about savings. Nobody thinks about the future. Survival until the end of this month is highly uncertain. How likely are you to be planning for what you're going to be doing 5 years from now? Very unlikely. But also, it's reflected not just economically, it's also reflected in all aspects of morality, on all the way in which we deal with each other as human beings. When your survival is precarious, how much are you invested in the notion of being a good citizen, on caring about your reputation, on caring about not getting caught in a crime? All of these things become harder to value. So people start committing crime, people start caring less and less about the future. And we see it reflected in everything. And I argue you see it reflected in architecture. We used to build houses in the 19th century that last until today. And then in the 20th century, we build essentially disposable cardboard boxes that get scrapped in 20 years.